All right. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to Teams Nation 2022. Very excited to be back again, and even more excited to have this fantastic panel with me for a session called Teams for America, Best Practices from the Field. In this session, we're going to review the benefits of Microsoft Teams through the lenses of governance, sprawl, training, and security. We'll use our experience to tell customer stories about how they're taking advantage of all Teams to have to offer and dealing with its many idiosyncrasies. My name is Jay Leask. I am the Director of U.S. Federal Strategy for AvePoint Public Sector here in Washington, D.C. I run with Craig Janke and a few others, M365 Chicago, as well as a couple of podcasts, one focused on government, one focused on Teams, and one on IT, general IT management. Although I don't know if you can say you run a podcast if it hasn't pushed anything out in like 5 months. So there's that. With me, Craig, Dan, Shari, and Stacy. Would you guys like to introduce yourselves, maybe alphabetical order? That means you first, Craig.
I said that was going to be me first. I read the email. So Craig Janke, customer engineer for Microsoft. Been doing like SharePoint and stuff for 10, 15 years, and have migrated through the stack through Office 365. So now I've been kind of specializing since COVID started, especially Teams. A lot of Teams implementations, a lot of Teams governance working in there, and lately I've been rolling into Power Platform.
All right.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. My name is Dan Ray. I am a 22-year Microsoft certified trainer, a MVP baby. I became an MVP in February of 2022, and I'm working with both government and healthcare customers with Teams implementations, either from the end user training perspective, champion support, or the administration side of things. And thanks for having me.
Great. I'm Shari Oswald. I'm a Microsoft certified trainer, Microsoft Office Specialist Master, and I've been a partner with Microsoft for about 10 years. And I focus on learning, adoption, and change management. So we focus on the people side of change. Let the tech side do the tech side. We do the people side.
Wonder Twin powers activate.
Hi, I'm Stacy Deer. I am the CEO and founder of a company called Focal Point Solutions, where we essentially do all that stuff except for, I send all my training stuff to Shari because, she is Shari. So I end up doing a lot of governance, security, compliance things around Teams, and also making sure that it is successful user adoption within organizations. So I stay pretty busy these days. So
Yeah, I think since COVID, we've all been pretty busy the last year and a half, 2 years. It's been quite the whirl. It's been 2 years now. Oh my gosh. Okay, so some quick business. Our Twitter handles are up on the screen, and I'm going to pull that down, but I'll type them out in the chat here. So you're welcome to find us all on Twitter. And there are no slides. This is a true panel. So in the spirit of panels, please feel free to post your questions in the chat, and I'll do my best to monitor those, and where they fit, I'll bring them into the conversation, and where it makes more sense to bring them up towards the end, we'll try to save some time at the end for questions as well. As I mentioned, we're going to talk about governance, sprawl, security, and training, hopefully get to all four of those with proper time management skills that my PMP once taught me. But let's kick things off with sprawl. And while I suspect we'll all have something to say, I'm going to offer this question up to Craig to get us started. Sprawl is not new. As someone who's been competing with, supporting, or using SharePoint since 2005, that number blew my mind, but Dan's got me beat. We've heard plenty about sprawl and even seen more terrible solutions to keep it from happening. Let's not talk about the nested subsite structures of SharePoint 2007 and 2013, for example. So
you just
Craig,
make me feel way old because I remember SharePoint before it was called SharePoint. So thank you for that.
Yeah, amen.
that's fair.
There's nothing
That
before that.
simply makes
Content
you more
management server.
knowledgeable. That's all.
Oh, we'll go with that. Yeah, we'll go with that.
So Craig, can you talk to us a little bit about the scope of the sprawl problem with Microsoft Teams and some of the do's and don'ts that you've seen your customers use to solve the problem?
But I can't call it a sprawl problem, like Jay. It's not teams doing it. It's the users and whatever in the organization. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah. So I guess what I saw initially, right, is people were starting to use Teams a couple of years ago, to about 2.5, getting into it, getting it set up. Wasn't a big deal. And then COVID hit, and then everybody was up on it, and they needed to be up on it fast. So governance wasn't really a thing that they were thinking about. They did know that they didn't want to have the problems that SharePoint had, where people were creating multiple sites and those kind of things. But organizations would turn it on, and they didn't quite realize. I think that we've gotten a little bit better about this now, that anybody could just create a team out of the box, right? So customers would spin it up, send it up to the users, and not realize that they were creating teams. So then you saw, I talked to a few organizations, like all of a sudden they had 50 to 100 teams they didn't even know about. So then it was a matter of, well, how do we manage that? And well, first thing was going through the list and seeing, well, we had test 1, test team, test 2, team test 3. Maybe we could delete some of those, right? Then the question is, well, how do I stop my users from creating them? And that's, I think, Stacy had kind of mentioned, like, processes and governance around that, and I'm sure she's going to talk to it more, but you can lock it down on who can create it. So a lot of times they just have IT still create them. And then how do you do that? So there's a process you can put around that. That can be just an email. It can be a task list. It can be a full out PowerUP, Power Automate process where somebody just has to approve that. And based on what they're doing, you might have different levels of proving it. Other things you want to do is, like I said, think about naming conventions, right? So making sure that people can find the teams and know what they do. So you don't get things like test team 1, test teams 2, test teams 3. And Jay, I know you've got a story about, I'll let you tell it later or whenever you want to, about naming conventions that a certain military organization had.
Yep.
And then I think it's about providing guidance, training, and periodically reviewing what you have. So, because a lot of organizations don't take that time to look and see what's out there, how long it's been there, is the content stale. So putting in those kinds of processes.
I honestly think Teams kind of gets a bad rap on the sprawl situation, because Teams I don't see as the bigger problem. It's the fact that you can create groups from 7 different places in the M365 platform. I see that as the lead sprawl, getter. Teams is just lumped in with that because it creates a group site on the back end, but it's one of many areas that it's coming from, right?
Yeah.
But the same rules that you just stated apply to groups as it does Teams. And I'm with you about locking that stuff down, just because it's a security risk, and just not having any process and procedures around it, it becomes rather crazy and resource intensive to tenants.
And you need a good information architecture. There's just no way to get around that. Tell people where to find things. If they can't find stuff because it's everywhere, then it doesn't do them any good.
Yeah.
To Stacy's point about the groups, I struggled for a long time to try to figure out, why do sometimes a group that you send, it hits everybody's calendar, and then other groups you send to just the group and it doesn't. And I think to Stacy's point, it's where the group was created in the first place.
Yep.
And the permissions.
Yeah. And not even knowing you're really creating a group. I mean, in OneDrive, it's create a library. I mean, who would have thought, right?
Right.
But it's, I mean, and if you add Yammer to the mix, then it gets even, you get it there too. So it's like, it's not easy for organizations to understand that or know. I mean, we know because we live it and breathe it every single day, but a lot of organizations don't know until they have some sort of assessment. And they're like, where'd all this stuff come from?
Yep.
And then the bigger issue that they run into is realizing that their defaults are set to the default that when their tenant was spun up, and they have now accumulated all these resources on sites that aren't even being used. So.
Right.
Yeah, I think to the point about groups, I think the last number I saw, Dux Raymond Sy had identified 17 different ways to create a group. And you're absolutely right. And the scary thing about that is you don't know groups are being created. You create a planner and a group was created, or worse, you create a planner and you go to delete it as a member of the owners group, and you might have just deleted a group or a team.
Yep. That you can't restore.
So
Anybody
yeah,
delete anything?
What's the you got to delete stuff, man.
Well, and then you get into the whole naming conventions, because
Yes.
you could have the same project, the same idea in different departments, and somebody has already used that name, or they created the accounting planner board and realized they just took that naming for any other entity that might need to be used for accounting. That that's that kind of thing. So naming conventions.
Yeah, the whole appending numbers at the end thing really confuses me. Why can't it just air and say rename, right? Because it would help eliminate some of that. Just adding appending numbers at the end is done no favors for admins.
Yeah.
So one of my favorite naming convention stories is we had a commercial customer, global commercial customer, who came to us because they had a data spill. Somebody in their Singapore office had created a team for the Singapore HR team, and they started collaborating, and they had locked it down so only the Singapore HR staff was there. But somebody else went, oh, the HR team. Well, the people in Europe should be here too. And so they brought all those people in there, and the next thing they know, they were sharing European persons data in a tenant that was stored, geolocated in not in Europe, and had people who didn't have the right to have access to that data because the team was called HR.
Yeah. The recovering HR professional on me, the hair just went straight up on my head.
Yeah, it gave me nightmares on a project I dealt with. It's very similar to that. And yeah, I went with a like, hey, this is how things are going to be named. Their stuff isn't. Just know that if it doesn't have this appended to it, not you.
Yeah. So okay. So let's take that corner and turn here. When we talk about Sprawl, you saw it naturally turned into a conversation about naming conventions, which is usually one of the first reasons that we throw some governance on something and it solves all our problems. You saw my air quotes, I hope. So Stacy, can you talk a little bit about how your customers are defining governance for teams or groups, and where you're seeing the definition of governance versus, and my favorite part of this, the implementation or automation of governance, and how that second part may affect the success of the first? That was a long question. I'm sorry.
Wow. Okay. We're going to take that in pieces a little bit here. So some of the things that we're seeing because of the whole sprawl, right? Like, I mean, I just told you I read your email, and then I just finished replying to a client who said, hey, Stacy, lock this down right now. Literally said right now. I'm like, well, I got to speak. I'll do it later. But anyways, the thing is they're noticing automatically. I mean, we're not even fully live in this environment yet. And they're like, oh my God, we're just getting all these sites and they don't make sense. And so I explained to them where they were coming from. And they're like, nobody needs to create these other than X people. Bingo, right? You nailed it on the head. Now you're feeling me why I said, hey, let's do this in the beginning. But you have multiple avenues for addressing it, right? Mm-hmm. You can lock it down and just say, hey, admins can go create it, whatever. But the thing, and you kind of hit on it, is I'm a bigger fan of the provisioner piece. Just because you can templatize it, and have their theme, attach it to the hub so they get all that stuff, comes down to the group site, you can teamify it, the whole 9 yards, because you're still empowering the users to create their own site. It's just being approved before it goes through, right? If you take the ability 100% away from them, then you start affecting user adoption around teams and sites as well, right? But people are quickly learning that you have to have policies. Well, if you have a policy, you have to have governance first. What is your governance? What is your compliance regulations, right? This company I was just referring to is healthcare, right? So, I've already given them their regulations and things that they have to be compliant to. And this was, making sure people don't have access to things that they shouldn't have access. So then you come to the public versus private teams and stuff like that. So there's a lot to do with compliance as well, but you have to identify what your governance is for your organization first. Make sure you have it documented, then implement it.
Mhm.
Because as we've all probably ran into, people who go out there and like, oh, I'm going to go create a retention policy, and they enable it, and then they say, oh no, that's wrong. You know, backing that out, not so easy, right?
Yep.
So a lot of how Microsoft is now driving things, they're forcing you to have governance, which I love. I mean, I've been preaching it for years. That's like my favorite word in the entire world. Now Microsoft has built a way inside these tenants to force you to have a governance.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's the one thing I really I love about it now. But I think people, ever since COVID and the security breaches with what we have going on in the world now, and seeing the cybersecurity attacks, I bet you I answer 15 to 20 emails a day in regards to security around teams and sites and tenants as a whole. And they're like, hey, we think we need to revisit our governance. Well, everybody should.
Yeah.
You should be revisiting it at all time. It's a living, breathing thing, right? You
It's
just
not a
don't.
set it and forget it thing.
No, unfortunately not, right? But all of this stuff with everything going on has just brought everything to light. And it's nice to see that people are starting to catch up with things that we have been, preaching for years.
Yep.
Right. So I'm excited about that. But, the provisioning thing, I'm also, as you know, a big user adoption person. I hate to take something away. So if you can still get them involved, the better it is, right? Just taking it away and saying, hey, you got to go put in a support ticket, not the way to do it. So I've come full circle.
Stacy and I have worked on several projects together where we made our suggestions to the client and they didn't want to listen. They didn't. They're like, no, I don't want to. Just move everything, including the files that are the system files that somebody backed up onto their network drive. And she knows exactly what I'm talking about, because they didn't go through anything. They didn't look at the content or where it was supposed to go or what should be moved or not moved. They just said, we don't want to deal with it. And then guess what? They ended up with a big mess later. So yeah, listen to Stacy. Mom's always right. Right? So I tell my kids, mom is always right.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny you talk about implementing carefully and thoughtfully implementing governance from the beginning. Craig mentioned earlier, we have a Department of Defense customer who came to us because they turned Teams on and put no controls around it. And wouldn't you know it, soldiers in the field don't care about proper use of technology. And they had 20,000 teams in the first 2 months. And quite a few of them were named with things that would get me kicked out of Teams Nation for utilizing, especially when followed by the name of their favorite general. So, real stuff there. And so it not just from a naming convention, but also from a use, how do you want to use the tool? You can use governance to guide people to use it correctly and to educate them on how is this going to be visualized to the rest of your command structure, for example. And so, yeah, I think that thoughtful execution of governance is huge. And one of my favorite phrases around it is if you define a governance plan, but don't automate any of the controls around it, all you're doing is creating a piece of paper that's going to be in a closet somewhere.
Yeah, my biggest thing around governance is if you do it properly within the environment, then the user can never shoot themselves in the foot.
Yeah.
You do not, as the IT, does not have a bunch of overhead on support tickets because you have set it right properly inside the environment and it just works, right?
Yep.
One of the biggest things, clients were telling me that there's like, well, this person's using this app in team and this app. And I'm like, are you allowing third-party apps in your teams without validation? And they're like, what do you mean? So I show them like the hundreds of apps out there, non-Microsoft apps. And they're like, I go, if you allow them to use it, you got to support it.
Yep.
And they're like, turn it off, please. Right. So vet them, know what you're getting into. Don't just go into it. Know what you're getting into. Otherwise, IT, we're already busy, right?
Yep.
And we're just going to be busier, and the users are going to be frustrated. And then
Absolutely.
again, we're stuck taking something away from them, right? Which we
Yep.
don't want to do.
So Stacy, you've hinted at security pretty well here. And Dan, you mentioned working in both government and healthcare, which actually leads perfectly to my next question, even though I didn't realize it. One thing that I see a lot of in the public sector space is the concern over security of highly regulated and sensitive data, especially when you're doing things like allowing external users via something like guest access. So can you talk a little bit about how you're working with customers to ensure the security of the teams and the data within it?
Sure. So I'm working with a large government agency right now for training both their support professionals and then the rollout to the entire organization. And one thing that they're frustrated with, but again, it's because of security, compliance, governance, is that they can't create teams and they can't even use the links that take you to teams.microsoft.com. They've disabled the hyperlinks for meetings. But in doing some of these things, they're giving people some of those guide rails, if you will.
Okay.
So they avoid some of the screen sharing mishaps that can happen.
Yeah.
So in Skype, this customer had the ability to share their entire screen. Well, we've all sat through or even maybe had our own moment of, I didn't mean to show you that. Well, in Teams, they decided we're going to lock it down.
Right.
In Teams, they decided to lock it down. You can only share an app. And
Okay.
some of the support people went crazy. That's not how my job works. I need to be able to see everything. Well, this is those guide rails of making your support job more difficult, but erring on the side of better security. So I've seen a lot of examples like that. And you're better off, from my perspective, tightening things and getting a handle on something, and then maybe coming up with, well, maybe this group, it makes sense to have different policies because they're not handling maybe sensitive information like another department is.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think it's always better to give them more than take things away. So start out with, giving them less latitude and then providing additional functionality as it's needed. That's kind of different from SharePoint from 20 years ago when we were locking everything down and people couldn't get anything. They said, well, if they can't see it, just let them have access to it. Well, especially I've worked a lot with the 3-letter agencies in the last couple of years as well. And the GCC and the GCC High, there's a lot of capability that's locked down. They can't even, unless they have their little card plugged into the machine, they can't even get in meetings or join anything. So it's that security is real. And I understand why. They're defending our country, but they're frustrated trying to get their job done too. So sometimes too much security can be a not necessarily a productive thing.
And it's pushing people. Sorry, it's pushing people to use the wrong tool. So if I can't create a team and Jay, Shari, Stacy, Craig, and I want to collaborate, well, we're just going to use chat because that's where we can put things together. So Jay shares a file. Where is that file stored? In Jay's OneDrive, as opposed to in a SharePoint library. So things like that may be inadvertent. Maybe inadvertent.
Thanks a lot, Dan.
Situations that they weren't aware of when they locked down. We don't want anybody creating teams. We'll get to that later.
Yeah. So I can't believe I'm the one that's going to say this, but also sometimes it comes down to training, right?
Yeah.
So, like the person does with the app, like, hey, I show multiple. Well, sometimes it's, train them, hey, it's real easy just to unshare and then choose the new app. Sometimes some people are going to be fine with that, right?
Yep.
But if they're having to do it all the time, right, then that might be a bigger problem. And I totally agree. Give them another, create a policy, have them be a little bit different. But sometimes it comes down to training and helping them be more efficient with it, and then they're okay with it, right? But when they have to figure it out themselves, they get frustrated. Then user adoption goes downhill, and like you said, find an alternate way to do it.
So Shari,
with other technology that's not approved by the organization, they'll take it outside.
Yep.
Yeah.
So Shari, let's take that turn. How do we balance the need for control with the end user awareness and training to make sure we have success, to make sure that they don't just go use another platform to share files where we have no control.
You know, when you're moving into a new platform, and we've seen this probably more in the last 2 years than ever, because everybody got thrown over the fence out of just survival mode, trying to get their job done and having to work remote. And I've seen this a lot, that they're using the same tools in old ways, or they don't know the capabilities, and providing the visibility about what those tools can do for you and make them excited about using them is key to making it a successful transition. And unfortunately, we haven't had the time to do that, or the planning to do that when we're in, emergency mode. But now that things have kind of settled, it's time to start bringing people in and sharing with them, did you know that you can do this? Now, my husband is a perfect example. He works for the fire department, and they moved into Teams because they had to start having remote meetings. I said, so I called him. I said, I'm working with the fire department. I need to know how to make a team that would respond to a wildland fire. I said, what would your channels be? And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, aren't you using Teams? He said, well, I chat with people and I make some phone calls. So I said, oh, so you're not using Teams. And
Right.
The IT department, and in my experience, even the customer success managers at Microsoft assume, because they've had it deployed for X amount of time, that people know how to use it. So providing what I call their drip campaigns. So I'm going to create an adoption strategy. Which of the technologies are you going to want to focus on? They say, okay, we want to do, have them promote Teams for meetings. Okay, great. Let's start doing a did you know campaign. Did you know that you can share your screen? Did you know that you can use PowerPoint Live? Did you know? And then a couple each week. And then, all right, what's the next one? So making people aware through an adoption, but solving their problems. We need to discover what those problems are first. What are you struggling with in your day? Oh, well, I need to collaborate on a file. Oh, did you know that you can co-author in Teams or in SharePoint? And start solving their problems. But we have to ask them first. Ask them first. Don't assume what their problems are or their knowledge is. Thank you.
What one of my favorite, and Benjamin put this in the chat, eliciting the real requirements and needs or wants is a balancing act. It is an act, period. One of my favorite conversations with federal organizations is I did a workshop about 3 years ago. We spent all day talking about teams and governance and planning and this and that. And they brought the Exchange team, they brought the identity team, they brought the SharePoint team, they brought someone from marketing, communications, and we all sat down for the day. And at the end of the day, the CTO said, okay, so 2 years ago, I was told to cut my budgets, and I got rid of all of our analysts, our business analysts. So I have very smart technologists who can do that role, but I don't have anyone who's dedicated to that. And you can't do what Shari is saying if you don't have someone who's asking these questions and then coming back to the technologist and saying, I need to be able to solve this problem.
Yeah, Dan and I lead these great sessions. They're called Customer Immersion Experience. And in the session, we ask them, the first part of it, it's, we have Microsoft coming to us, telling us what they want. We've got the IT department coming to us, telling us what they want. But then we get in this session and we start going in a roundtable saying, what in your day could be easier? What hurts? And by the end of the session, we solve their pain. And it is transformational because we are asking the people that are there. So we also have to balance out what Microsoft wanted and what IT wanted. But really, it's the people in the room that matter, because they're the ones that are going to go out and evangelize. Say, did you see this cool thing I just found out? And those become your champions, right? Yep. Dan, you work with champions as well. We need those champions to help spread the word, because we can't do it all by ourselves. And IT saying you have to now is never effective. We have to move up because they're no longer supporting Office 2010. We were, 12 years later, we need to move them up into the new technology, right? It's time. And that never works. They need to want it. We need to make them want it. So.
Yeah, I love the fact that, in addition to governance and all that kind of stuff, I think the whole COVID thing has also exploded the need for training. People are like, hey, I got budget for training now. I'm like, what do you mean you never train? They're like, oh, well, we've learned that we've made some, mistakes. And I'm like, I've got that person for you. She will get you straightened out, right?
That's
Shocker.
fantastic.
Yeah, right. And I'm like, everything is really coming full circle. The things we've just been preaching for years, and I hands off to Microsoft for helping with that, with how they've built the M365, the tenants out and everything like that, because forces governance, forces training, because now they don't know what they don't know, right? And they're asking now before they just, hey, I got this, I'll figure it out. It's not so
and
easy.
the training has to be consumable. People don't want to go sit in a Word Level 1 class all day or a Teams class all day. We need to give them bites that solve their problem in the time of their need. And I think that's a big one.
Yeah, snippet videos are heaven these days. I'll tell you that. So,
I've done a few for you, Stace. Just a few.
Just a few hundred.
So let me jump into the chat here. So Hal made a statement: teams in a business of 25 people or less is an adventure. And that's really interesting, because I'm dealing with customers that are, thousands, if not millions of users. The Department of the Army with 1.4 million potential users in their tenant. How are any of you dealing with the small businesses, the 25 or less users, and how are you approaching that differently than you would say the million user organization? Maybe that's extreme.
Well, interesting that you say that, because my next meeting after this is with a company of 2.
Okay.
Right? But it's a financial institution, right? So from the security and compliance area, do I treat them any different than any other finance, industry? No, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, how training and bringing apps on board and getting them acclimated, absolutely, because it's more of you can do that one-on-one thing, right? Them spending a huge amount of money to send someone to training when they're a company of 2, not going to happen, right? But the bigger ones, you get up to 25, you get the opportunity for more training, not as much hand holding, because they're all busy, because they are small and company. But I don't see a difference when it comes to security, compliance, and that stuff, because everybody has to be safe. It's everything above and beyond that starts to deviate between the sizes, for me anyways.
I think it's also a perfect opportunity to use the team type where it has everybody in the organization. There's that sweet spot of you're too small for maybe Yammer or some of the other tools for all company communication. Maybe Teams and a all org team makes sense for that, 25 to 50 or 25 to 100. But you get above that and it starts to make less and less sense.
Yeah.
Okay. So
and if they're going to grow, you got to start with that foundation in mind. It's like they need to be able to grow into it, because I'm working with some customers now that have created that all company team with a channel per department, and all the chat and banter that's happening is now blowing up everybody's activity, because and so that's not necessary in a small company. That's okay. A large company, eventually we need to make, again, information architecture, give them, spaces to work. Who needs to work together as the team? What are they working on as the channels? And how are they going to get that work done is the tabs across the top when you add the different tools. And, remember, keep that in mind. That's always my advice.
I like that statement. You have to be able to grow into it. So you may be 2 people right now, but if you have a growth plan and you become 50 people, how will those early decisions have to be addressed as you start to reach different milestones?
Yeah. Too many teams can be real when they're small, but eventually they'll be grateful for it instead of everything piled into one thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And Michael actually put something in the chat that it was funny. I was just getting ready to speak on that. And I totally see that approach all the time. I can tell you right now, I have 30 clients that I don't do anything but their security and compliant, do quarterly maintenance, all that kind of stuff, just going out there, running the reports, see the changes Microsoft has, have they regressed anything, stuff like that.
Yeah,
I see it all the time, because they don't have time for that stuff internally, especially in the smaller companies, right? So they need someone to make sure that they stay safe and secure. So I see it all the time.
Yeah, I know in the defense industrial base, which are the systems integrators and the manufacturers that support the Department of Defense, there are organizations as big as Lockheed Martin with 100,000+ users, and there are organizations of 2, 4, and 10 people. And in those smaller organizations, there are organizations that specialize in providing Teams as a service or O365 management as a service.
Yep.
So definitely an approach I've seen.
Yeah, I can guarantee you I've written more statement of works around that than I have with with a lot of things in the last 2 years.
Yep. So there was an interesting question here, and I don't know, this one may or may not be answerable based on the group, but is there any current data on the return on investment of getting users to embrace the various features? If I can say, we'll save this many dollars if we use Teams 20% better, that'll get more attention, more leadership buy-in. Have you guys seen anything along those lines?
Well, it depends if they're it's much easier in SharePoint and automation, right? But for Teams, it comes down to, what do they use now? Do they pay for it? Do they pay for it? The monthly support or yearly support and maintenance contract versus something they're already own, right? Because they have the license for. So a lot of times it comes down to that, plus whatever they're currently using, how long, what is your functionality? What are you doing? What is the complications with that tool versus, using Teams? That's a harder one to measure, but sometimes it just comes down to what you're using now versus Teams. And is there money associated with it and stuff like that? Above and beyond that, I don't have a better answer if anybody else does.
I guess if you have costs associated with storage, that might be something that you could point to. Travel costs is something else that I thought of, Shari.
Yep.
Yeah, the productivity score, if you look at the usage and productivity score in Microsoft, it'll show you. And, you can easily divide that by the budget that you're spending on licensing. If you're spending $100,000 on licensing and they're only utilizing 10% of it, you have a 90% ROI available to you. And how do we bring those scores up? It's by training and awareness. And I could beat that drum all day long because, that's what I'm passionate about. But, there are some quantifiable options, some great tools out there that dig even deeper than just the, productivity score across the organization, that give it down to like the group if you're that big and you want to know. But yeah, all of that, that screams at me, that productivity score. Let's get that up so we're utilizing things.
So
I don't know if it's just Teams, but I think that Stacy touched on it too. Office 365, you're paying for a lot that I know customers have gone out and bought third-party tools too.
Yeah.
So whether or not the third-party tool was a better solution for them, but maybe a feature that they didn't know, especially when you get into the security realm of things that Office 365 or M365 can do. And then, with the collaboration portion, I still know a few customers out there who are using a different webcasting solution, right? So
they own Teams. Yep.
Yeah, they own Teams, but they're using a third party to be able to do virtual meetings, right? So they're doing that and then sharing files, maybe still using like a Dropbox or something like that. So they're yes, Jay.
No, I was going to let you finish that sentence.
So there's a lot of things that Teams does that people may or may not know that it does, which again, they don't know what they don't do, but they don't realize that they're paying for it too.
So as the third-party vendor in the room, I will say there is a third-party ecosystem for a reason, but use it smartly. Evaluate what your license covers and get rid of the duplicate software. You don't need Box and Office 365. You don't need I can't even think of the names of the menu, WebEx and such, right?
SurveyMonkey for surveys. If you're using advanced functionality, maybe limit it to the people that need that advanced functionality. Shari and I both worked for a partner that used SurveyMonkey because they had so many trainers doing training that saving the time of, here's a link that takes you to Dan's class versus Shari's class versus Jim's class, was something that I don't have to ask the end user then. And inevitably, when I did those sessions, people said, hey, why are we using SurveyMonkey? We just learned about forms. And back then you could say, here's a perfect example of why the third party is being used versus the inbox.
Yep.
So I have a perfect story that kind of puts it into perspective. I used to work for a rather large company. I won't say their name, but a rather large company. And of course, they made a mistake putting me on a committee that reviews projects that come to the table that people want money for. And of course, being in the, the area that I was Lotus Notes and then, went to SharePoint and all that kind of stuff. One day someone came to the table and wanted a workflow tool. And I was like, we already own one. Why would we spend the money for another? And they're like, what do you mean? What one? So I said, hey, I know of 2 of them in the company right now. So I mentioned their names. And so, of course, it got put on hold. Well, of course, I kind of stirred a hornet's nest. And so then the company started wondering how many duplicate tools we have out there.
Oh.
So interestingly enough, to find that out, they purchased a tool. The funny side of it, but to scan the environment for applications that were being utilized, and they got a list. Yep. In the end, there were like 8 different tools that were being used for workflow. There was just a ton of stuff that was duplicated all over. So they started weeding down. In the first year of weeding out duplicate, they saved almost $10 million in support and maintenance contracts.
Yep.
Yeah. Same thing. I had a nonprofit I worked for here. Same thing. They had 16 reporting tools. They were paying each department had purchased their own. This was a company that was very small and grew very fast. And so each department was kind of disconnected. And same thing. I worked for the director of strategy. And he's like, we need to know what y'all are using. Yeah. And we created a big list of what those were. And yeah, it was ridiculous. And then the duplicate, they were paying per terabyte of storage. Mm-hmm. And after doing a inventory of all of their documentation, 40% was garbage because it was duplicated or it was out of date or it's rot, it's redundant, outdated, or just plain old trash. So
that's funny. I know what ROT stands for. I talk about it all the time. I've always called it trivial data, but trash is so much more appropriate. So I think there's a couple of things to take away from that. Where are you potentially using duplicate tools? How are you spending money where, you might not need to be based on your licensing options? What data can you evaluate and get rid of to help save costs there? And the other piece of that Shari Evans asked the question, she brought up that they use email right now. Everybody has spent time using email there. One thing you got to ask yourself is the tool I'm using secure enough for my data? And the answer, it always has been, is not usually accurate. So you really have to evaluate what kind of data do we have and what kind of security do we need to put around that? Because using Teams and OneDrive and SharePoint gives you much more control than simply passing files back and forth via email. So something else to consider.
Yeah, when you're looking at those third parties, please look at the security. I mean, I have to be honest, I had a client that decided to turn off OneDrive and use Box.
Yep.
Wow. Compare the security. There is no comparison there. We're all about security these days and making sure your data is safe. So not only look at functionality, that should definitely have to, meet as many requirements as possible, but also make sure that it meets your security requirements as well. Otherwise, you could be making a really big mistake.
Yep. And look at, as a third party, look at the certifications that they have worked towards getting. Yep. We got a FedRAMP accreditation for a reason. It allows you as a customer to assume a certain level of control because a third party has, not me third party, has looked at my documentation and tested my controls to make sure that what I'm saying is accurate enough to control your content, to secure your content, that is. So that's absolutely, Stacy, you've got to look at what investment is your vendor putting into the content. And nobody is investing more in security than Microsoft. Right. So one of my favorite conversations on the security side was, before everyone was acknowledging the cloud was the right direction, especially in the government side, I can secure my data better than someone else's cloud can. And I'm like, okay, what's your security budget? And what's Microsoft's security budget? And if you don't trust their security budget, what's going to happen to them if they fail? So it's a long
Always
conversation.
positioned it this way. Think about your organization and who are the best IT people in your teams, right? Usually that's, I mean, let's be honest, usually that's a handful of people, 2-3 people
Right.
that you really, really trust. And they don't work 24/7.
Yep.
Unless they have to. And Microsoft picks the best coming out of college, right? Or in their careers who have proven it. So, and they've got teams of these people working 24/7. So
People like
That's-
Craig that they snapped up.
yes.
Yep.
Exactly.
Well, I'm the exception to the rule. I'm just going to utter. One of the things that I wanted to mention, though, since we're talking real life scenarios, I've got a very, very large customer right now that got hit with a regulatory request, right? So we're talking upwards of 30,000 people they had to put on a legal hold. You know what e-discovery is, one, and how that works, and how you do compliance searches, and maybe how you have to perform those extracts of data on a small scale so that you can scale it up, because it wasn't easy to just go, oh, hey, we need this by the end of the week because somebody missed the deadline. HR legal sent it and said, hey, you know what? We got this request and now we need to fill it by the end of the week. This should be easy for you, right? It's only a terabyte worth of data that you probably have to evaluate. So,
Well, and that's where the compliance reporting comes in handy, right? People think that the compliance thing is all technical where you got to go configure stuff. It's not. It's informational, it's operational, all that kind of stuff, which is why people are like, well, I'm not going to go through that. There's like 800 things on the list. I'm like, yeah, but you only have to deal with the things that you actively are using in your environment, plus things that could potentially come up tomorrow, like, the e-discovery, right? Make sure you have your plan, how you use it. That's what that compliance report is for, right?
Yeah.
You shouldn't be overwhelmed by it. I mean, I export it, I put filters in, I show the client, this is what you're using, all that kind of stuff. And I go through it and I'm like, this is just as important as the security, because if you're not prepped and ready, that's money out of your pocket.
Right.
And the other interesting thing that most organizations don't know, because they always have to explain them the first time they want to go through and do an e-discovery case or a compliance search, is those have very specific, unique permissions that those people need to use, and global admins just can't run them.
Correct.
So, so to take a time and look at that and plan that, you may, as an organization, get sued. You may, as an organization, have a regulatory agency wanting information for you. So you have to be able to produce it. And then that goes into other things like retention policies. Like, I don't want to have to produce data that was here 10 years ago when I was supposed to get rid of it after 3 or 5, right? So
you always have to prepare for the worst.
Yeah.
Always.
Yep, absolutely. So there was one other question. We have about a minute and a half.
Okay.
There was one other question that I thought really cued off of what we were talking about here. If you're the lone wolf, the single individual trying to do all of these things, how do you secure your business so that if something bad happens to you, your customers are still set. They still have something to happen, So if you're a small business or providing that service to someone else, how do you make sure that they're successful if something happens to you? Any ideas?
Well, I can tell you what I do is I try to bring all their governance data to one place. So
Okay.
I've created, I used to create a classic governance site and I save it as a template and I would give it to people, right?
Yep.
Here, go start. Here you go. Now I built one in Modern and I, assign, ownership and there's, expirations, but it's putting all the content in one place. So if someone's gone, the content's still in one place. Someone can go and see it. It's categorized very easily so they can read it and they know how their environment is configured because all that information is right there. So getting it into a singular location and having metadata associated to it and who is the subject matter expert identified will be huge for you. In any organization, period, but especially in small ones, if you are a single threaded, admin person.
Yep.
Especially and you said it, in their environment, not yours.
Yes.
Right? Yeah, because they need to have access to it. If you win the lottery and run away, because we'll use that scenario instead of something else more nefarious. You know, they need,
So
they
in
need to be able to
general,
get their stuff.
IT, I know we're talking IT. And what do you do if your head IT guy goes away, right? But just as an organization as a whole, in every business I've been in, organizations as a whole struggle with contingency planning and succession planning. What do I do if somebody gets promoted? What do I do if somebody leaves, right? What if somebody gets a better job? So yeah, I think you just got to build that in.
Yep. Governance.
And that's where you call
It's
Shari, because
all
that's a
about
cultural shift.
Governance. You got your governance in place. You're good.
So first of all, Stacy, Craig, Dr. Dre, and Shari, thank you all for joining me on this panel. For everyone in the audience, thank you for your questions and your participation. Please go to teamsnation.rocks/feedback and provide feedback. I think if you look alphabetically for my name, that's where the session will be. But we would love your feedback to know if this format worked and if you got, what you were expecting. And absolutely, if you have additional questions, don't hesitate to reach out to any of us on Twitter, or all of us, and we'll keep the conversation going. Thank you, everybody.
If you just send him to Jay, he'll route you to the right person.
Yo, Jay.
Lodge and in charge.
Jay is now our admin for the group.
There you go.
Thank you very much to all of you. It was really great to listen to you, get the experiences from your personal project experiences. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.